What's up YouTube, and welcome to another draw along with me. Today's tutorial is this astronaut floating away with our little planets that are shaped like balloons. For this tutorial there is a link in the description to the palette as well as a stamp for our little astronaut here, which you're going to need before you get started. If you're new here, I post Procreate content every single week, so if you'd like some tutorials to follow along with, hit that subscribe button down below and turn on the notification bell. And as always, a huge shout out to my patrons. I'll throw their names up on the screen now, where if you'd like to show your support for my Patreon, you get access to extra tutorials every single month exclusive to Patreon users, as well as access to our Facebook group and extra benefits on my Discord server. So with all that said, let's get started. So as always, let's create a new canvas for today. So let's create a new one up here, and we're going to create one at 2500 by 2500. And once we're into our canvas, we're going to go ahead and change the background color. So let's go to our layers, and then you'll find the background color layer. And we're going to swap it out in our palette for the darker blue in the top left hand corner. So now that that's done, let's hit done. And now on our new layer, first of all, let's go to our colors and let's double tap in the top left hand corner to select white if we haven't already. And then you're going to want to use the Spaceman brush stamp that I've put in the description down below. And if I make my way to my brush in my brush library, we end up with our nice little spaceman here. And what we're going to do is our brush size is set to max, so I'm just going to tap in the middle of the screen and we'll end up with our little spaceman for today's design. So let's go ahead now and scale that down. So let's go to our cursor, go to uniform, and then that will make sure he stays in proportion, or she, and then let's position that and get the size that we want. Now I want to make mine roughly around about this sort of size, and I want to position it straight down the middle of the canvas. Now you want to get that orange line down the middle, and you want to go to snapping, and you want to turn on snapping. And that's pretty good for the moment with me. Gives enough space for all of our balloon planets above. Next, let's go to our layers. Let's create a new layer. Let's drag it underneath our astronaut. And then what we're going to do is we're going to go to our brush library. We're going to go down into the calligraphy section, and we're going to use the monoline brush. And then for this, all we're going to do is, and don't worry about your brush size, is we're going to draw a circle in the middle of the screen to start with. Hold your pen at the end to get a perfect eclipse, and pop your finger on the screen to get a perfect circle. And you want to make it quite big, but not so that it leaves the canvas. And then drag and drop your colour in like so. Now what we're going to use for this is we're going to use this for the curvature of the planet. So we're going to go to our cursor now. We're going to use the freeform option so we can change it how we want. Let's drag that down, and then let me zoom out. And then what we want to do is we want to grab these handles on either side and just drag it out until we get a lovely perfect curve, and just enough so that we end up one in the middle of the design, so we get that orange line down the middle again, but just enough that we get a little slither towards the bottom. So something like that for me is good, and I'll zoom in to show you what I ended up with. Just a little bit of height down here in either side, but we end up with a perfect curve across our screen. Now what we're going to do is and now while we're on this layer, let's go ahead and adjust it and make it more of a rocky terrain. So let's go to our brush library, and under calligraphy still, let's scroll down and use the script brush at the bottom here. And my brush size is set to roughly around about 10%. Now what we're trying to do is here, we're going to create the overall outline shape of the planet, and then we're going to go ahead and start to erase some details, just like the astronaut here at the top. So let's zoom in now, and we're going to add in the first crater on this left hand side. So what I want to do is I want to create a little flick up like that, and let's add in the corresponding flick on the other side. And then now I'm zoomed in, let's just create a little eclipse. So let's go over the top and around like that, and I'm doing it freehand, I'm not holding to adjust or make it a perfect circle. Something nice and free like that is good, and just make sure you link up your gaps on either side. Now what you want to do is just drag your colour into this space only and leave that little bit of the crater at the top there. So when I zoom out, we've got our first one. Now let's do the same on the other side. So first of all, let's create our first little flick up. Let's create then the corresponding little flick down. And then zooming in, just want to create that round circular crater at the top. And then make sure all your lines are just linked up on either side so that you can drag and drop your colour into this space here. And then if I zoom out, we end up with two craters on either side. Now at this point they're looking very uniformed. You could leave it exactly as it is, but we're going to go ahead and just rough up the edges a little bit. So that's like a bit too much of a perfect curve. So if I zoom in on this one here on the left hand side, I'm simply just going to create some little bumps and lumps either side of it, just to break up that surface and then make sure it's not so smooth up and smooth down. And likewise, you may want to do that out here too, maybe create some rocks of some sort, so some sort of bumps and lumps. And by all means, change the brush if you've got something that's a bit more rigid and not so rounded as this. Something like that's good with me. And I'm going to zoom across and do the exact same thing over here. So just rough up this edge with some bumps and lumps. And just creating those bumps in the screen like so. And then I might add a little bit of a rock or something here, just underneath, and just rough up that surface a bit more. And now when I zoom out, we end up with our little planet that's got a bit more texture to it. Now the final thing we want to do is with this planet is add in the details much like our astronaut here, where we're using the negative space. So sticking with the same brush, we're simply just going to switch out the color, and we're going to switch it out to our background color, which is this one here in the top left hand corner of our palette. And now here we just want to draw in some shadows and then some just little extra bumps and lumps. So primarily I want my lighting to be quite central and around this astronaut in the center here. So everything is going to create shadows sort of outside of it. So what I mean is if I zoom in here, I just want to essentially outline this outer edge here. So I'm just going to create like a little squiggly line and then a little flick around the top of the crater. And that's all we're going to do. And just add in some bumps and lumps in this space here, like so, which is just creating our planet. And we're just roughing it up. We're just adding in some rocky areas, like so. Maybe yours will be slightly smoother like this one, or bumpier like this one here. And then let's do the same for the craters themselves. So adding in some little bumps and lumps. And let's just tail that one off as well, and add in one more bump in here, and just flick that out like so. So you might want to go in and thicken out some of the ones that are facing completely away from our subject, like there, and likewise maybe over here as well. Maybe thicken up this line here until you end up with something a bit more like that, and then thicken up this line as we go around our crater. But when we zoom out, and then let's add in actually one more here before we do so. And when we zoom out, we should end up with a much more rockier surface here. Just a very simple sort of illustration really, just to add in some extra texture down here. Now let's then adjust sort of the background touches. So let's go to our layers. First of all, we're going to swipe on our little planet layer here to the left hand side and hit duplicate. And then on the duplicated layer, we're going to go to our layer options, and we're going to use the option of overlay. Now we won't see any visual change just yet, but then we're going to go to our adjustments, Gaussian blur and layer, and we're going to blur this out so that we create a bit of a glow off of this planet. So if you swipe from left to right, you start to see, if I do it quite quickly, you can see it sort of bounce up and down with the glow. Now I'm going to go for something a bit drastic, so something maybe around about 50%, and then hit my adjustments when I'm done. While we're on the subject, let's add in our background glow as well as our night sky sort of lines through that sky. So let's go to our layers. Let's create a new layer. Let's drag that layer underneath the glow that we just created. We're going to go to our colors. We're going to use this slightly lighter blue here. And then we're going to go to our brush library. Under airbrushing, we're going to use the soft brush. My brush size is set to, let's go a bit bigger, let's go 45%. And what you're going to do is you're going to tap in the middle of the screen. Now visually you might not see a huge change here, but what we're going to do is we're just going to grab our cursor and you'll get the box where you've added that glow. Let's just position that first of all perfectly in the center of the design. So let's find the orange lines both horizontally and vertically. And I believe something like that's actually bang on, there we go. And that's good with me. I'm going to then go to my layers. I'm going to swipe this layer to the left hand side and duplicate it. And I'm going to go to my layer options by tapping on the N. And we're going to go all the way down towards the bottom until we get the exclusion layer option. And that will add in a lot more of a blue color just in behind our astronaut here. and I'm going to leave that as is for the moment. Maybe we'll come back and adjust it afterwards. Now let's go to our layers. Let's create a new layer, and it should be just above our two sort of blue circles, but underneath our planet. We're going to go to our colors. Let's switch the colors out to white now. And then let's go back to our brush library, back to calligraphy, and use the script brush. Now what we want to do with this, we kind of want to draw some S shapes in the sky and then repeat the process and fill the gap in. So we're just creating some sort of nice lines through the night sky. So I'll show you what I mean by that. I'm going to start quite close up towards this top right hand corner, and I'm just going to create some S's like that. So little squiggles backwards and forwards. And then I'm going to come across. I'm going to repeat the same sort of shape, but what I've done is I started quite thin here, and then it got thicker, and then got quite thick as I left the design. And then I'm going to drag and drop my color into that space. And that's perfect. That's what we should look for. And let's add in another one here, but a lot thinner. So just adding in some S's like that. And then maybe make this one really close. And you don't have to rush your line. You can keep it quite slow and just make sure that you end up matching up these shapes to one another. Drag and drop your color into that line as well. And then all we're going to do with this is simply go to our layer options again. We're going to tap on the layer, and we're going to go all the way down to overlay, which is going to start to bring some of the color in from behind. And then we're going to lower the opacity down of this layer until we get something maybe roughly around about 15%. It's meant to be just a little background design and not too prominent in your face. So if I tap away from my layers now, we've got these little night lines in the sky. Now I'm just simply going to make mine bigger because I've got quite a lot of drag off here on the left hand side. I'm going to go to my layers, I'm going to go to uniform, and just make them a little bit bigger and maybe even off to the side. So you can adjust your layer if you want to afterwards. It's not the final piece. So I've actually gone for that now. So that's what I'll leave that as. I wanted to make sure that there's more context in the middle, and these nicely just tail off either side. Now let's add in our night sky in the background. So let's go to our layers again. Let's create one more new layer. Now in the description down below, I've left a link to the stipple collection, which I commonly use for stars. So I'm going to find the stipple collection within my brush library, and I like to use the light one. Now you can vary your brush size depending on how big or small you want your stars to be. So I'm starting roughly around about 80%. I'm going to tap away on the screen. Now these ones are fairly large, so I'm only going to do a few like that. And then I'm going to reduce my brush size down. Let's go down to 50 now, and then again tap away, adding in some nice random spots onto the screen. And then I'm going to reduce my brush size down again one more time to, let's go 20%, and that should be a nice smaller set of stars. And I'm going to fill in a lot more with the gaps now, just tapping away in the gaps and trying to concentrate most of it mainly towards the center, and making sure not to overdo it in a certain area. You want to have a nice random spread of the stars and not too many too close together. Now I'm actually pretty happy with that, so I'm going to leave that as is. And then we are going to go ahead now and start to add in the little planets that we're going to use. So let's go to our layers and let's take a look at what we've got so far. We've got all the background content down here already done, and our astronaut at the top here. So we want to go to the very top layer. Let's create a new layer, and then also create another new layer as well. And then on the two blank empty layers that we just created, we're going to swipe on one of them while the other one is highlighted, and we'll get the option to group them together. Now this will make life a lot easier now when we progress through this. So on the second layer, the bottom one out of the two within the group, we're going to go to our brush library, and we're going to go back to calligraphy, and we're going to use the monoline brush again. And again, your brush size doesn't really matter for this. It's just a matter of how big or small you want to make your planets. Now this is going to be the first planet. Now this should really be the biggest planet that you create out of your little group of planet balloons, if we want to call them. And then all the other ones should start to get smaller as you sort of decorate around it. So I'm going to draw a circle on the screen, and then hold my pen at the end to get a perfect ellipse, and then put my finger on the screen to get a perfect circle. I'm going to go for something roughly this size to start with. And if we start with the biggest one, we can always scale it down afterwards. And then looking at the proportions, I'm going to simply move my astronaut man down a little bit further to something closer to there. and then I've got a lot of space now to add in my strings. So if I go back to my layers, in this group now we've got a white circle and an empty layer. Now what we're going to do is, if you look at the palette, and let's select this circle before we do so. If we go to the palette, I've added in a few different colours. By all means, select your own colours for this, and maybe even replicate the actual solar system if you wanted to per planet. But I'm going to create some sort of random colourful planets for my collection. And each one I've actually created a slightly darker colour and then a lighter variation on it for this particular style. So we're going to select the lighter colour first of all, which is this green, and then I'm going to drag that into the circle. And now how we go about getting the lines on the planet, we're going to go to our layers, and then on this empty layer we're going to tap on it, and we're going to use the option of clipping mask. And then we're going to go to our colours. Let's switch it out to the darker version of the colour that you want to use, or by all means you could use blue now if you wanted to, but I'm going to use the green, the darker version. And then with my brush set to the script brush under calligraphy at the bottom, my brush size is set to 10 or 11%, and we're going to draw some horizontal lines just straight through this circle. Very rough, we're not holding down, we're not doing anything in particular, and we're trying to do different weights of lines, and some nice thin ones running through, but also some big chunky ones as well. Now this is something that you want to sort of end up with. You want to end up with some sort of lines like this. And now we're going to have some fun with the liquefy effect and just change this up per planet and add some different styles in for each one. So if we go to our adjustments and we go to liquefy, I'm going to zoom in on the planet so you can see everything that I'm doing. And you can see all my settings down here as well. I'm going to reduce my brush size down actually. Let's go down to about 40%. And I'm just going to start messing around with all these different lines and just creating some cool squiggles in there, adding some nice twirls, and use the push tool if you want to, if there's something in particular that you want to adjust and maybe push outwards. You want to end up with something like that. And then hit your adjustments when you're done. And we're almost done with creating our first little planet here. Now when we go back to our layers and we go back to the circle underneath the actual sort of main circle of the planet, we're going to go to our colors and let's switch it out to white by double tapping in the top left hand corner. Let's go to our brush library and under airbrushing, and we're going to use the soft brush. Let's reduce the brush size down to roughly around about 15%. And then we're going to go back to our layers and just make sure our layer, we're going to tap on it and make sure alpha lock is turned on. So we can only paint now within the boundaries of that circle. And then we're just going to swipe from left to right, just towards the bottom edge of the planet only, until you end up with a little look like this. So we've basically painted in some white that fades into the green, and then all these darker lines fade over the top. And now the final touch before we start to then duplicate this for all the other planets is we're going to go to our layers and we're going to swipe on the planet and use the option of duplicate. And then the second one out of the two, we're going to tap on it and we're going to use the option of fill layer, which will fill it in with white because that was the last color that we used. But if we then tap on the layer again, we can invert it to black. Then what we're going to do is we're going to change the layer options to overlay. And then we're going to simply grab our cursor. Let's move it upwards ever so slightly until we end up with this sort of black sort of semicircle around the top. Let's go back to our layers now. And let's lower the opacity down until you're happy with the percentage of what we're trying to make here. So I'm going to drop mine down and I'm going to go somewhat bold at around about 20%. Now what this is going to do is every time we now duplicate this for all the different planets, each one will have its shadow already done. So it would save a lot of time going forward. So now we're done with this particular planet. We can go and collapse the group down. And let's get started on creating some more. So let's swipe it to the left and duplicate. And then let's just grab this one that we just duplicated. Let's grab our cursor first of all, and make sure you're always under the uniform option. Scale it or down or bigger or smaller, however you wish. And I'm going to move mine over here slightly. I'm going to scale it down a bit more. And now this is the process how we're going to go forward in terms of adjusting it for each one. So we're going to go to our layers again, and then inside the group, we're going to go ahead and change our lines at the top here first of all. So we're going to go back to adjustments, we're going to go to liquefy, and we're going to adjust this one using whichever settings you like for this planet, so that all the lines are different every single time we do this. So I'm just going to run my pen through and create some fun shapes. Now I've got a big gap in there, so I'm just going to move that down like that and maybe push it back in. That's good with me. And then what you want to do is on the base layer for the planet we'll start with, let's go back to our adjustments and we're going to use the hue, saturation and brightness toggle, and we're going to use the layer version. Now this is our friend down here that we're going to use for a lot of this, the hue slider, which will adjust the color for each individual planet that we're going to create. So all we want to do is then drag it, and you want to find a color that you like, really. So I quite like what we're getting there, quite like an orangey peachy color, and I know I've left it on 32%. So then all I have to do is just go to my layers now, and that layer is done. On the lines above, we simply then go back to adjustments and hue and saturation and the layer version, and then drag our little handle down here to the 32% mark, and then we end up with that double tone palette. And that's our second planet. And we're going to just repeat that process until you're happy with the collection of planets that you've created. So I'm going to go for around about 7 different planets, and you'll be able to see my process as I go through it. So let me repeat the process again. I'm going to duplicate the orange planet this time, and swipe it to the left and duplicate. Grab my cursor with the uniform option still selected. We'll drag this one into position where I want this. So I'm going to scale this one down a little bit more, and something maybe like that is good. And then we go back to our layers, and then we want to end up on the lines first of all. So then we move the lines around for the planet by liquefying them. I'm going to use the 12 left option this time, and maybe change your pressure, your distortion and momentum for each one, so you don't end up with something very similar to one another. And also just try different things. Maybe you try the crystal effect and move some lines in and out or in slightly different directions. I'm going to leave mine roughly like that. And then I'm going to go to my adjustments again and hue and saturation and layer. And then this time I'm changing the lines first. But let's find a color that we like. Oh, it's a nice pink color. Let's drop it down to 35%. And then we repeat that number here for the main body of the planet. So we go back to hue and saturation and brightness, and we drop this down to the same number, so 32% I think I had, and then I end up with that dual palette again. And let's carry on doing it. We want to try and, like I said, maybe replicate the actual planets of the solar system, but otherwise you can create whatever sort of lines you want in there. So I'm going to now duplicate the green one more time, because these lines are starting to get really distorted in here. I want to make sure that they're nice and solid still. So I'm going to distort the green one, so I'm going to swipe it to the left and duplicate it. And I'm going to use the bottom one out of the 2, because you also want to layer your planets as well behind one another, and work out how you want to lay them out like that. So let's go to our layers and our cursor, and let's then scale this one down into position. So maybe this one flares out over here somewhere, and you want to try and make sure that not 2 planets are the same size. So maybe I need to go smaller here, really, like so. And then we're going to go to our group. Let's move the lines around first. So I'm going to go to that layer in that group. And then we're going to go to our adjustments and liquefy, and start to twirl and push our lines around so that we don't end up with the same planet every time with this style. Now I can see quite a lot of repetition here. I can see a curl here and a curl here. So I'm going to use the 12 left option now, or even the right option, and let's undo that. And you only have to hold your pen down for a second and you end up with something completely different. And then I'm going to go back to my adjustments. I'm going to go to hue, saturation and brightness, and let's drag the scale down again, or even up, either way. So we've already done a pink. I'm going to move all the way through the spectrum. I'm going to go for a nice blue now, so 92%. And then we're going to go to our main layer of the body of the planet. And we're going to repeat the process. Adjustments, hue, saturation and brightness, and layer. And then we're going to find the 92% mark. And we end up with a nice little planet in there as well. And every time we create the planet, they're also casting shadows on one another, which is nice. So that saves a lot of time later on. And let's keep going. So let's go back to our group. I'm going to duplicate this blue layer this time. Swipe and duplicate. And then on the bottom one out of the 2 for me, I'm going to go back to my cursor with uniform. I'm going to scale this down. Let's start to think about how we can either go wider or further up. So I'm actually going to go wider this time. I'm going to set this one quite small and maybe out here, and maybe think about how we position this apart from the rest. I'm going to go to my layers in that group and I'm going to start adjusting the lines within it. So let's go back to adjustments, liquify. I'm going to use 12 left. Let's zoom in on this little guy down here and start to really twist that out and have some fun adjusting the lines. Now sometimes they may get really distort like that, where I would just undo it and then maybe think about using the push tool instead and adjust the lines in that sense, and then maybe then go into the twirl, because you don't want them to end up too distorted. We want to end up with some nice solid lines running through it to an extent. You can also go to your adjustments for that particular layer and maybe rotate it if they really are starting to like repeat themselves with one another, and just make sure that your lines look different to the rest. And now let me go to my adjustments, hue, saturation and layer. Let's find another color that we like the look of. Let's try and find a nice yellow. And at this point you can mess around with the saturation if you wanted to, as well as the brightness, so you'll end up with some more brighter colors such as this. Let's try and work out a little yellow in there. So it looks like 99% and 61 brightness. And then I just need to repeat that on the planet below. So I'm going to go back to my planet layer. I'm going to go to my adjustments, hue, saturation and brightness and layer. And I think it was 90 up here somewhere. And then increase the brightness as well. But I'm not going to do that too much actually, because that actually looks pretty cool like that. And then hit the adjustments. And now I am, how many in? 5 in. We can go ahead and add in a couple more. I want to add a white one this time, maybe symbolize the moon. So let's go to our layers. And again, my lines are starting to get pretty distorted over here, so I'm going to duplicate this green one more time. Let's go to that group, swipe it to the left and duplicate. And then on the bottom one, I'm going to grab my cursor, make sure the uniform's still selected, and let's create a moon up here, so a white version this time. So I'm going to go to my layers now. Let's adjust the lines first of all. So we're going to go to the line layer. We're going to go to our adjustments and liquify, and let's mess around with our little lines in here. Pushing them around, making sure that we end up with something different to the rest. Maybe even push this down a little bit more, or maybe even inwards as well, because there's a lot more context out here that's not yet been brought in. And now for this one, I'm going to go to my hue, saturation and brightness, except this time I'm going to adjust it and make it nice and bright and start to desaturate it as well, which will take the color out of it until I end up with something like 64% and 0 saturation. So that's, we want to make sure these lines are darker, remember, so this is the first take on this. So I've gone no saturation and 60 brightness. And then on my base planet now, I'm going to go to hue, saturation and brightness and layer. And I'm going to somewhat repeat that. So let's lower the saturation all the way down. Let's increase the brightness. And this one, I think that's actually pretty good. I think 60, exactly the same, is pretty bang on. So I'm going to hit my adjustments because I'm done with that. And I'm going to add in one more planet now over here on the right hand side. So I'm going to go to my layers. I'm going to swipe the green one again, because if you're now going to create a colourful planet, you just want a colourful planet that you used beforehand as well. So let's swipe on the green one more time and duplicate it. And then the bottom one out of the two, let's grab our cursor and the uniform option, scale our little planet down and pop it into position. Something like that's good. And then I'm going to grab my layer within this group for the lines, and I'm going to go to my adjustments, liquify, and let's just push this one around. Let's see what we can make with it. Maybe move our lines very horizontal, and straight away I'm pretty happy with how that looks. And I'm going to go back to my adjustments, hue, saturation and layer, and let's find a color now I've not used. So let's scroll through here, try and find a color, maybe a very dark purple. So I'm actually going to go all the way down to none on this one in terms of the hue. And I'm going to do the same on the planet. So I'm going to go to my adjustments, hue, layer, and drag it all the way down till I end up with a nice purple layer. So now all of our planets are in position, in my design anyway. We can finally go ahead and add in the little strings for the balls of the planets into his hand or her hand. So we're going to go to our layers now. Let's collapse all these groups down. And if you want to make life a little bit easier, all of these groups here are our planets. you can group groups as well. So if we swipe on all of these groups here for our planets and hit the option of group, we can then collapse that down and it makes life a lot easier, and we can turn all of them off in one go. So let's create a new layer. Let's drag that underneath that group of all those planets, and then with our brush selected as the monoline, so we're going to go to our brush library and calligraphy. Let's go to the monoline brush. Now I do have a couple of different variations on this, and I'll pop it in the description down below, because I have one that's the monoline, but it's very small in consideration to the normal monoline brush at 1%. So I'll pop a link in the description down below if you want to install this one. Otherwise just use the normal monoline brush down to 1%. And then on this layer we're just going to draw in some strings to the hand. So the hand here, we want to reach this point here, and then we want to also reach the center of the circle. So starting from the center of the circle, we're going to draw a straight line to the point of the hand, and then hold with your pen and then leave it in that position there, and repeat that process for all of the circles until we end up with a nice tie of all of them. Now the one thing you want to try and do is try and make sure when you do the center of the line that your lines don't sort of run straight over one another. So what I did was, when I did this line here for this circle, I moved it ever so slightly to the left because I knew I needed to make room for this one coming through on the right hand side. If I didn't, these lines would be very close to one another and you'd end up with a nice, ended up like thick bunched up lines, which is not what we want to achieve. So I'm going to go now from the moon all the way down to that point. And then the blue one, I'm bearing in mind again this orange one, I'm going to do it slightly off to the right hand side into this point. Let's go from the center of this one here too. And then finally the yellow one all the way over there into our hand of our astronaut. And then let's zoom out. And then the final touch I want to add is a couple of shooting stars in the background. And at this point you can also scale up and down your planets as well if you want to. So like zooming out here, I could go to my layers, and as long as I select the lines that we just drew in and this big group of all the different planets, so swipe left on both of them and then use the adjustments and the uniform option, you can easily make them a little bit bigger if you wanted to. Let me scale them down a tad and position them. As long as this point down here reaches the hand, you could end up with something like that where the planets are a lot bigger this time. And the final touch I'm going to add in is a little shooting star in the background or two. So let's go to our layers and then let's create a new layer somewhere down here. So just underneath our spaceman is good. And then how I do mine is if I go to my brush library and scroll all the way down under calligraphy to script, I simply just quickly draw in a dashing line across the screen like that. And let me draw in another one here too. Let me redo that one. That one's good. And then all you do is then just erase the tail off of the shooting star. So you go to your eraser, tap on it, and you want to find the airbrushing section and the soft brush. Reduce the brush size down. I'm going to go 15%. And then you just circular motion, just tail off nice and lightly the end of the shooting star until it's completely transparent. And then likewise over here too, you just repeat that process like so. And if I pop my pen on the top and go full screen with 4 fingers, we end up with today's finished design. So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you did, drop a like down below, helps the channel out an awful lot. And if you'd like some tutorials to follow along with every single week, hit the subscribe button as well and turn on the notification bell. As always, be sure to share your designs with me on Instagram. The links are both in the description down below to my Instagram and TikTok. And be sure to tag me actually in the post so I don't lose it in my feed. As always, a huge shout out to my patrons. I'll throw their names up on the screen now. Whereas if you'd like to get some access to some extra tutorials every single month, as well as access to our Facebook group and extra benefits on my Discord server, hit the link in the description down below and show your support. And I'll see you in the next one.